Imagine a boy, barefoot and hungry, working in the choking air of a Scottish textile mill. Now imagine that same boy, years later, controlling more money than entire nations, building an empire of steel that touched every corner of America. This is the story of Andrew Carnegie, the immigrant who rose from poverty to unimaginable wealth, the philanthropist who gave away more than any man before him, and the ruthless industrialist who crushed unions and broke lives. His shadow stretches across the Gilded Age, a shadow made of steel, power, and paradox. Andrew Carnegie was born on November 25, 1835, in the modest town of Dunfermline, Scotland, a place that at the time still carried the traces of medieval grandeur with its abbey ruins and cobblestone streets, yet had been caught in the grinding upheaval of the Industrial Revolution that was transforming Britain. His parents, William Carnegie and Margaret Morrison, came from respectable artisan stock, but lived on the fragile edge of poverty. William, a skilled handloom weaver, once enjoyed a secure trade, but by the 1830s the weaving craft was being swept aside by mechanized looms in factories that churned out textile faster and cheaper than any craftsman could manage. The decline of the weaving trade was not gradual but catastrophic, and William, like thousands of other handloom weavers, saw his earnings shrink until they could scarcely support the family. Margaret, determined and resourceful, became the family's mainstay. She sewed shoes and sold small linens, taking in work whenever she could to keep the household afloat. The Carnegies lived in a cramped one-room weaver's cottage on Moody Street, where Andrew and his younger brother Tom shared sleeping space in conditions of extreme modesty, and where every penny had to be stretched against hunger and debt. The shadow of industrial displacement, unemployment, and food scarcity was a constant presence in Dunfermline. To understand Carnegie's later drive, it is essential to grasp that he was raised amid the tension of a world where traditional trades were collapsing and survival required adaptability. He saw firsthand the gulf between skilled laborers who had once commanded respect and the same men reduced to begging or accepting charity. His father, proud and principled, attended meetings with the Chartists, reformers demanding political rights for working men. But the family's daily struggle underlined the harsh reality that ideals did not put food on the table. By the mid-1840s, with weaving no longer sustainable, the Carnegie situation grew dire. Margaret bore the greater weight of survival, pawning belongings and managing debts, while William's weaving work dried up. The family watched others from their town depart for the New World, and soon the possibility of emigration became a pressing question rather than a distant dream. Letters from relatives in Pennsylvania spoke of opportunity, of steady work, of a society less bound by hereditary class. In 1848, with their finances at a breaking point and prospects in Dunfermline almost extinguished, the Carnegies made a decision that would alter not only their own destiny, but, in time, the economic destiny of America itself. They would emigrate to the United States. The journey was not one of glamour or privilege, but of desperation mixed with hope. They borrowed money for passage and boarded the SS Wiscasset, sailing from the Clyde to New York and onward by canal and riverboat to Pittsburgh. For the 13-year-old Andrew, this voyage was both terrifying and exhilarating. He left behind the narrow streets of Dunfermline, where his world had been defined by the rhythms of weaving looms and the austerity of scarcity, and encountered the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the crowded decks of immigrant ships, and the promise of a land that was already being mythologized as a place where hard work could lead to prosperity. Upon arriving in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, then a gritty industrial suburb of Pittsburgh, the Carnegie family confronted the reality that opportunity did not mean ease. The city was thick with smoke from iron foundries, glassworks, and factories. The air reeked of coal, and the landscape was dominated by industrial machinery, and rivers turned dark with waste. The Carnegies rented a two-room house in a poor immigrant neighborhood, not much larger than their old dwelling in Scotland, and immediately had to find work to sustain themselves. William attempted to continue as a weaver, but quickly discovered that the mechanized textile industry in America had little room for his craft, and his failure to adapt haunted him. The responsibility for supporting the family increasingly fell on young Andrew and his mother. Andrew's first job was as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning a mere $1.20 a week. His task was to run spools of thread to the weavers, a job that was exhausting, hot, and dangerous for a boy his age. Yet he carried out the work with diligence, aware that his wages were vital to the family's survival. The experience left him with an indelible memory of labor at its most grinding and reinforced his determination never to remain trapped in such wake. His mother, Margaret, meanwhile, began taking in boarders and selling homemade items to supplement the family's income, her strength and resilience providing the stability that her husband could not. Though the family's first years in America were fraught with hardship, Allegheny also exposed Andrew to something he had not known in Scotland, the possibility of upward mobility. While poverty was real and pressing, he witnessed neighbors and acquaintances who managed to climb into better positions through persistence, connections, and skill. The cultural rigidity of Britain, with its entrenched class barriers, was less pronounced in America, and this difference planted the seed of ambition in young Carnegie. He took night classes to improve his education and borrowed books from the small library of Colonel James Anderson, who opened his personal collection to working boys every Saturday. Access to these books became a turning point. Andrew read voraciously, absorbing literature, history, and philosophy, and cultivating a lifelong belief that knowledge was a key to advancement. His exposure to ideas beyond the factory floor fueled a growing conviction that he was destined for more than manual labor. The family's fortunes, however, remained precarious. William Carnegie died in 1855, having never found secure footing in America, but Margaret's tenacity and Andrew's relentless drive gradually pulled him into greater stability. By his mid-teens, Andrew had secured a job as a telegraph messenger, delivering messages across Pittsburgh, a role that provided him not only higher pay but also critical exposure to the city's business and industrial elite. He taught himself to recognize signals by sound rather than by reading them visually, an unusual skill that impressed his superiors and allowed him to advance rapidly. His competence and eagerness caught the attention of Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the most influential men in the industry, and this connection would soon propel Andrew from the world of bobbin boys into the corridors of power. Yet it is important to recognize that Carnegie's path was not one of smooth ascension from the start. His early life was defined by the insecurity of immigrant existence, the daily confrontation with hunger, and the knowledge that survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and education. The Carnegie's choice to leave Scotland was not motivated by romantic ideals of America, but by the hard reality that industrial change had left traditional workers destitute, and that only in a new land could they hope to rebuild. For Andrew, the experience instilled a lasting awareness of the fragility of economic security and the gulf between the boss and those who control capital. These memories of hardship shaped both the ruthless ambition that characterized his rise and the philanthropy that defined his later years. He never forgot the boyhood nights in Dunfermline when food was scarce, nor the suffocating days in Allegheny's mills. They became the twin engines of his philosophy, the determination to escape poverty and the belief that wealth carried a moral obligation to provide others with opportunities for self-improvement. The immigrant boy who began life in a one-room cottage and worked as a bobbin boy in a Pittsburgh mill was already absorbing the lessons of industry, ambition, and struggle that would make him one of the defining figures of the Gilded Age. His early years were neither glamorous nor extraordinary in appearance, but they were the crucible in which his character was forged. From rags in Scotland to iron in America, the foundations of steel yet to come. When the Carnegie family settled into their modest home in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, in 1848, they had traded the worn stone streets of Dunfermline for a city that was rapidly becoming one of the most industrialized corners of the United States. Pittsburgh and its surrounding district were known as a smoky city, where chimneys belched black clouds into the sky and coal dust coated every surface. For immigrants arriving with hopes of stability, it was a place both of opportunity and a hardship. For Andrew, only 13 years old, The promise of America revealed itself not through wealth or comfort, but through labor, long, exhausting, and often dangerous. His first step into this new world of work came at Blackstock's cotton factory, where he was hired as a bobbin boy. 6 days a week, from before dawn until after dark, Andrew raced between spinning frames, replacing spools of thread and keeping the machine supplied. The cotton mill was a place of relentless motion, deafening noise, and hazardous conditions. Boys of Andrew's age, some even younger, toiled alongside women and men, all of them driven by the necessity of survival rather than choice. His weekly wage was $1.20, meager by any standard, yet vital to the family's subsistence. This initiation into the American workforce exposed Carnegie to the brutal reality of child labor in mid-19th century industrial America. Across the nation, thousands of immigrant children worked in textile mills, coal mines, glassworks, and factories. They were valued for their small size, nimble fingers, and willingness, or rather their inability to refuse, to work for low wages. Reform movement against child labor was still decades away, and for families like the Carnegies, the economic necessity overrode moral or legal objections. The Allegheny cotton mills were not unique. They were part of a larger pattern where industrialization drew in children as expendable laborers. Reports from the era describe how children worked 12-hour shifts, often barefoot, surrounded by exposed machinery, with little regard for safety. Injuries were common: crushed fingers, mangled limbs, respiratory illnesses from inhaling fibers. For Andrew, the work was a crucible. He later recalled that those early days in the mill left an indelible mark on his memory, a reminder of the hardships that shaped his determination to rise above the fate of a common laborer. Yet even amid this grinding existence, Carnegie displayed signs of resilience and ambition. Unlike many boys who resigned themselves to such work indefinitely, Andrew sought knowledge and improvement. After his shifts at the mill, he attended night school, learning arithmetic and English. His appetite for self-education was insatiable, and his encounters with Colonel James Anderson's free Saturday library for working boys became pivotal. In an age when books were luxuries beyond the reach of the poor, Anderson's library opened the door to worlds of knowledge, history, and philosophy. Andrew devoured volumes on literature, politics, and economics, cultivating an intellectual foundation that would later underpin his philosophy of wealth and philanthropy. Meanwhile, his family continued to struggle. William Carnegie, Andrew's father, had failed to adapt to the mechanized American textile industry. He attempted weaving and other forms of work, but could not secure consistent employment. His skills, once respected in Dunfermline, were now obsolete in the industrialized economy of Pittsburgh. The family leaned heavily on Margaret, whose resourcefulness was their lifeline. She took in boarders, sewed, and traded goods, demonstrating a tenacity that Andrew never forgot. He often credited his mother's resilience as a true force that carried them through the bleakest years. By 1849, Andrew found a new opportunity, a job as a messenger boy for the Ohio Telegraph Company. The position paid $2.50 a week, more than double his mill wages, and offered exposure to the bustling world of communications and business. This transition was monumental. The telegraph was cutting-edge technology, shrinking time and distance, revolutionizing how information moved across America. As a messenger, Andrew darted through the city delivering important messages to businessmen, merchants, and industrial leaders. His work required reliability, speed, and attentiveness, and Carnegie excelled. More importantly, he began teaching himself to read telegraph signals by sound, an unusual skill that allowed him to transcribe messages without written code. This ability distinguished him from his peers and marked him as a young man of unusual initiative. Through the telegraph office, Carnegie came into contact with the networks of power that ran Pittsburgh's industries. He delivered messages to railroad executives, bankers, and entrepreneurs. His diligence caught the attention of Thomas A. Scott, then a superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who would become Carnegie's first great mentor. Scott recognized Andrew's abilities and offered him a position as his personal telegraph operator. This was not merely a job, it was an entry into the corridors of influence. The railroad in mid-19th century America was a backbone of expansion, commerce, and industry, and working under Scott placed Carnegie at the very heart of progress. Yet before this breakthrough, Carnegie's years as a mill worker and messenger encapsulated the harsh world of child labor that millions endured. Across Pennsylvania and beyond, children made up a significant portion of the workforce. Census data from the 1850s indicated that in some industries, 1 out of every 5 workers was under the age of 15. The logic was simple but brutal. Children were cheaper to employ and easier to discipline. Employers argued that families needed the income, and society at large largely accepted the practice as inevitable. Reformers who later criticized child labor pointed to the long-term damage it caused: stunted growth, lack of education, chronic illness. But in Carnegie's youth, these warnings had little impact. What distinguished Andrew was not the hardship itself, for that was common, but his response to it. Where others remained trapped, he cultivated skills and connections that allowed him to escape. The Carnegie family's immigrant experience mirrored that of countless others. They arrived with little, endured grinding labor, and clung to survival through adaptability. But Andrew's path diverged as he seized every opportunity to climb upward. His story illustrates both the cruelty of child labor and the possibilities that America, despite its inequities, could offer to those determined to rise. In later years, when Carnegie reflected on his journey, he often emphasized how the library of Colonel Anderson and the mentorship of Scott shaped him. He contrasted his hunger for books with the drudgery of mill work, presenting himself as proof that knowledge and ambition could break the chains of poverty. Yet critics later argued that his own steel empire would perpetuate the same cycles of exploitation he had once endured, a contradiction that shadowed his legacy. Nevertheless, the trajectory from bobbin boy to telegraph messenger symbolized a crucial transition. It demonstrated how, in industrial America, child labor was both a curse and a crucible, a system that crushed many but forged a few into figures of extraordinary influence. Carnegie's rise did not erase the suffering of his early years. Rather, it embedded in him a lifelong awareness of labor's harsh realities, even as he later occupied the heights of wealth and power. The Allegheny of the 1840s and 1850s was a city of smoke and sweat, a landscape where fortunes were being built on the backs of workers, many of them children. For Andrew Carnegie, those threads of poverty were the fabric of his beginning, and though he would leave the mills behind, their memory remained woven into his identity, pushing him toward the relentless pursuit of success and, eventually, the conviction that wealth carried obligations far beyond its acquisition. By the early 1850s, Andrew Carnegie had left behind the suffocating cotton mill where his childhood had been consumed by the whir of machinery and the weight of poverty, and he now stood at the threshold of America's emerging communications revolution, working as a messenger boy at the Ohio Telegraph Company in Pittsburgh. This was no ordinary job for a teenager. The telegraph, only recently introduced after Samuel Morse's successful 1844 demonstration between Washington and Baltimore, was transforming the speed and reach of information, shrinking distances and accelerating the pulse of commerce and politics. For Carnegie, the messenger's role meant far more than running slips of paper through smoky streets. It was a window into the very nerves of a nation, where news of markets, shipments, and political decisions flowed in real time. He delivered messages to banks, warehouses, and railroad offices, and while other boys treated the work as drudgery, Andrew absorbed everything. He watched how businessmen interacted, how decisions were made, and how influence passed from one office to another. Determined to stand out, he mastered the art of recognizing telegraph signals by sound alone, a skill that set him apart from his peers and allowed him to transcribe messages more quickly than anyone else. This ability drew the attention of his superiors, who promoted him to operator. In the 1850s, telegraph operators occupied an elite position within communications. They were trusted with sensitive information, sometimes before even the intended recipients. Carnegie gained not only technical proficiency but also access to the rhythms of business and industry at a moment when Pittsburgh was expanding into one of the nation's industrial capitals. The telegraph office connected him with powerful men, and it was here that fate aligned him with Thomas A. Scott, the rising superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division. Scott, himself ambitious and perceptive, recognized Carnegie's intelligence, diligence, and uncanny memory. He took him on as his personal telegraph operator and assistant, offering the young immigrant a direct pathway into one of the most powerful institutions of the age, the railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was not merely a transport company. It was the lifeblood of America's expansion, binding together distant cities, fueling commerce, and moving armies when conflict erupted. To work under Scott meant exposure to decision-making at the highest levels of industry. Carnegie now transmitted not only commercial messages, but also learned how logistics, finance, and management operated within a vast and growing enterprise. He sat in on meetings, observed negotiations, and became familiar with the scale at which capital and labor intersected. Through Scott's mentorship, Carnegie was introduced to the world of investment. The telegraph and railroad systems were inseparable. One carried goods, the other carried information. Carnegie's proximity to both gave him a unique vantage point. He began to invest his modest savings under Scott's guidance, first in small ventures related to railroads and bridges. By the late 1850s, he had secured his first significant return through an investment in Adams Express, a company that specialized in parcel delivery along the railroad lines. The dividends he earned represented more than money. They were proof that capital could grow not only through sweat but through strategic placement, a lesson that would underpin his later empire. Yet Carnegie's education and power came not only from business but also from crisis. In 1861, as the Civil War broke out, the Pennsylvania Railroad became essential to the Union War effort. Scott, promoted to Assistant Secretary of War, was responsible for managing military transportation and telegraph operations, and he relied heavily on Carnegie to assist in coordinating troop movements, supplies, and communications. Carnegie's organizational skills and mastery of telegraph systems made him invaluable. He oversaw the rapid repair of telegraph lines, managed logistical bottlenecks, and ensured that the Union Army could move with unprecedented speed. This wartime experience cemented his understanding of how large-scale systems operated under pressure. It also exposed him to the immense profits that could be made through government contracts and war-related industries, a reality that shaped his pragmatic view of capitalism as both an engine of progress and a tool of opportunity. By the time the war ended, Carnegie was no longer a poor immigrant boy scrambling for wages. He was a man with connections, investments, and experience in the infrastructure that would define America's industrial age. His trajectory from bobbin boy to telegraph operator to railroad protege highlighted the centrality of communications and transportation in the mid-19th century. The telegraph had given him a skill set that brought him into contact with the nation's elite. The railroad had given him mentorship, access, and the understanding of scale. Together, these institutions taught him the language of power, that control over networks of information and infrastructure meant control over the economy itself. Carnegie's rise during these years also reflected broader shifts in American society. The mid-1800s were a period of extraordinary technological and economic growth. The expansion of railroads knitted together what had once been isolated regions, turning local economies into a national market. Telegraph wires paralleled railroad tracks, ensuring that goods and news could move at unprecedented speed. For immigrants and ambitious men like Carnegie, these systems offered opportunities to climb beyond the limits of birth or circumstance. But the same systems also deepened inequalities, as those who controlled capital and information accumulated immense wealth, while laborists often remained trapped in dangerous and low-paying jobs. Carnegie, having risen from the latter, understood both sides of this divide. He never forgot the cotton mill, but he also embraced the ruthless calculus of investment and opportunity. His years under Scott instilled habits of efficiency, delegation, and strategic vision that he later applied on a far grander scale in steel. In reflection, this chapter of Carnegie's life was less about wealth accumulation and more about education, not in the classroom, but in the offices, train yards, and telegraph stations where the arteries of a new industrial nation pulsed. His ability to read signals by ear symbolized a deeper talent, the capacity to recognize patterns, anticipate needs, and act decisively. These traits, sharpened in the crucible of telegraph clicks and railroad timetables, became the foundation upon which he would build one of the greatest industrial empires in history. The immigrant boy had not yet become the Steel King, but by mastering the language of the telegraph and the networks of the railroad, he had entered the world of capital and command, a world from which he would never look back. By the time Andrew Carnegie entered his 20s in the late 1850s, he had already transformed himself from a millboy earning pennies to a trusted assistant within the most powerful transportation network of the United States, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it was here, under the guidance of Thomas A. Scott, that his apprenticeship in the art of capital began to evolve into something far greater, the making of an industrialist. Carnegie had learned the technical language of telegraphs and timetables, but now he immersed himself in the financial logic of railroads, where profit was not only earned by transporting goods and people, but multiplied through investments in the systems that supported them. Scott, who regarded Carnegie as a protege, introduced him to insider opportunities, ventures that were available not to the public but to those with access to contracts, supply lines, and knowledge of future developments. One of Carnegie's first significant moves came with his investment in the Adams Express Company, which specialized in parcel delivery across the rail network. At a time when wages for skilled workers rarely exceeded a few $100s a year, Carnegie's small stake began returning dividends that dwarfed his salary, awakening him to the reality that ownership, not labor, was the path to wealth. The experience was intoxicating. It confirmed what he had already intuited from watching the businessmen of Pittsburgh. Those who controlled capital, not those who sweated in factories or toiled on tracks, determined the future. His investments broadened, often guided by Scott, into ventures in sleeping cars, rail-related businesses, and, crucially, iron bridges. During the 1850s, as America expanded westward, the demand for stronger infrastructure grew. Wooden bridges, prone to fire and collapse, were increasingly replaced by iron structures that could support the weight of modern locomotives. Carnegie became an investor in the Keystone Bridge Company, which pioneered the use of iron in bridge construction, and this decision was pivotal. It aligned him with a material that would dominate the next half-century, iron, and soon, steel. At the same time, Carnegie mastered the mechanics of corporate finance. Railroads were the first modern corporations, raising vast sums through bonds and shares, requiring complex systems of management, accounting, and hierarchy. Working closely with Scott, Carnegie absorbed these lessons, understanding how capital could be leveraged, how expansion was financed, and how networks of influence between bankers, politicians, and industrialists determined success. This was not abstract theory, but practical education in the crucible of America's most dynamic industry. By the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, Carnegie had positioned himself as more than a promising employee. The war, which devastated countless lives, became for Carnegie a moment of immense professional growth and financial opportunity. When Scott was appointed Assistant Secretary of War, Carnegie accompanied him to Washington, tasked with coordinating the telegraph and transportation networks that became essential to the Union cause. He oversaw repairs of rail lines destroyed by Confederate raids, directed troop movements, and ensured that supplies reached the front lines efficiently. The experience gave him a unique perspective on logistics under pressure and reinforced his conviction that infrastructure, rails, bridges, ironworks, was a backbone of national power. More significantly, it exposed him to the profits tied to government contracts and wartime demand. Carnegie invested in businesses that supplied iron to the Union, profiting handsomely. Critics later condemned the opportunism of war profiteering. But for Carnegie, the conflict accelerated his evolution from employee to entrepreneur. By the war's end in 1865, he had accumulated enough capital to leave the Pennsylvania Railroad and strike out on his own, a remarkable leap for a man who had arrived in America less than 2 decades earlier with nothing but his family and their debts. His ventures in the post-war years focused increasingly on iron production. He expanded his stake in the Keystone Bridge Company, promoting the superiority of iron bridges to skeptical railroad executives and personally guaranteeing their strength. He reinvested profits into iron mills, securing a foothold in an industry that was becoming indispensable to America's growth. The late 1860s and early 1870s marked a true turning point, as Carnegie moved decisively into the iron industry with the establishment of the Keystone Iron Works and later the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, which would become the crown jewel of his empire. These enterprises were not mere workshops, but modern industrial facilities, integrating cutting-edge processes like the Bessemer converter, which allowed molten pig iron to be transformed into steel quickly and cheaply. The adoption of such technologies revealed Carnegie's defining trait as an industrialist, the willingness to embrace innovation that could reduce costs and increase output, even if it meant radical change. Unlike many conservative manufacturers, he recognized that efficiency, scale, and reinvestment were the keys to dominance in an industry defined by relentless competition. Carnegie's rise during these years also depended on his ability to navigate the turbulent waters of capitalism with a shrewdness that bordered on ruthlessness. He reinvested profits aggressively, rarely hoarding wealth for comfort. His modest salary and personal spending contrasted with his bold financial decisions, where every dollar was put to work in pursuit of expansion. He cultivated networks of investors, often drawing on his Scottish immigrant community, convincing friends and relatives to pool resources into ventures he managed. Trust in his judgment, reinforced by his record of success, made him a magnet for capital. Yet Carnegie was not merely a financier. He was deeply engaged in the operational side of his businesses. He studied production methods, scrutinized costs, and demanded efficiency. His partnership with engineers and managers demonstrated his belief that technical knowledge and financial acumen must work hand in hand. In this sense, he represented a new type of industrialist, neither an isolated inventor nor detached banker, but a hybrid who fused vision, capital, and technology into one enterprise. The making of Carnegie as an industrialist was also tied to his growing reputation as a spokesman for progress. He published essays and gave speeches extolling the virtues of industry, the transformative power of iron and steel, and the destiny of America as a land of limitless growth. His optimism about industrial capitalism, rooted in his own immigrant journey, contrasted sharply with the bleak realities experienced by many laborers, but it resonated with the spirit of the Gilded Age, where expansion seemed boundless. At the same time, cracks began to appear. His relentless pursuit of profit often clashed with the conditions of workers in his mills. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous environments were already becoming points of contention, foreshadowing conflicts that would later erupt in strikes and violence. Carnegie, however, justified these hardships as temporary sacrifices in the march toward industrial progress. In his mind, efficiency and cost reduction were not optional but essential, and only through them could America's infrastructure be built. By the early 1870s, Carnegie had crossed a threshold. No longer dependent on mentors like Scott, he had become a leading figure in the iron and steel industry in his own right. His businesses were integrated into the arteries of the nation's economy, supplying rails, bridges, and structures that defined modern America. The immigrant boy from Dunfermline was now recognized as one of the most ambitious and capable entrepreneurs of his generation. The trajectory from messenger boy to master of iron revealed not only individual determination, but also the larger forces of the era: technological innovation, the expansion of railroads, the voracious appetite for infrastructure, and the willingness of capital to flow toward those bold enough to seize opportunity. Carnegie embodied these dynamics, and in doing so, he forged the foundations of an empire that would soon dominate global steel. The making of an industrialist was complete not in the sense of finality, but in the sense of readiness. Carnegie now possessed the skills, capital, and vision to transform himself from a participant in industry to its undisputed leader, and the next chapters of his life would unfold not in the modest offices of Pittsburgh, but in the furnaces, mills, and boardrooms where the age of steel was to be born. By the 1870s, Andrew Carnegie's path was converging with a force of history that would define not only his fortune but the very shape of modern civilization. Steel. Iron had carried the Industrial Revolution through its first half-century, building railroads, bridges, and machines. But steel was stronger, more flexible, and more durable. The problem was that steel had traditionally been expensive to produce, reserved for cutlery, small tools, and specialized uses rather than mass infrastructure. The turning point came with the Bessemer process, developed in England in the 1850s by Henry Bessemer, which allowed molten pig iron to be blasted with air, burning off impurities and producing steel quickly and cheaply. Carnegie, always scanning for innovations that could cut costs and increase output, recognized that this was no minor improvement but a revolution. In 1872, after visiting Europe to study the process firsthand, he resolved to bring Bessemer technology to America on an unprecedented scale. Upon returning, he invested heavily in building the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, named after a respected Pennsylvania Railroad president. And this mill became the most modern steel plant in the world when it opened in 1875. Unlike the scattered ironworks of earlier decades, the Edgar Thomson plant was designed from the ground up for efficiency, scale, and profit. Massive blast furnaces, rolling mills, and converters turned out rails and beams at a rate previously unimaginable, and costs plummeted. Carnegie's genius lay not in inventing technology, but in recognizing its potential and applying it with relentless focus on efficiency. He reinvested profits, expanded facilities, and drove his managers to cut expenses at every turn, establishing a business model that emphasized continuous reinvestment and technological innovation rather than short-term gain. The rise of Carnegie Steel coincided with America's insatiable demand for railroads. Between 1870 and 1900, the nation's rail network expanded from roughly 53,000 miles to more than 190,000, and every mile required thousands of tons of steel rails. Carnegie positioned his company as a dominant supplier, undercutting competitors with lower prices achieved through economies of scale. His philosophy was simple but effective: make steel cheaper, sell more of it, and use the volume to crush rivals. The strategy worked. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel was the largest producer of steel in the United States, and his mills at Braddock, Homestead, and elsewhere became symbols of industrial might. Steel did not remain confined to rails. It became the skeleton of America's cities, rising into skyscrapers that transformed skylines, girders for bridges that spanned rivers once thought unbridgeable, and the material of ships, factories, and machines. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, stood as a testament to the new age of steel, while Chicago's early skyscrapers hinted at the vertical future of urban life. Every ton of steel rolling out of Carnegie's mills was shaping the modern world. Yet behind the glowing furnaces and monumental achievements was a system of labor that demanded immense human sacrifice. Carnegie's relentless drive for efficiency meant longer hours, stricter discipline, and fewer workers per unit of output. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, were the norm in his mills, with men laboring in searing heat, surrounded by molten metal and deafening machinery. Accidents were frequent, and fatalities were often accepted as inevitable. While Carnegie wrote essays about the uplifting power of wealth and opportunity, the reality for his workers was a life of exhaustion, danger, and low wages. This contradiction would eventually ignite some of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. Carnegie, however, saw his role as advancing progress. He argued that lowering steel prices ultimately benefited society, making rail travel cheaper, buildings stronger, and commerce faster. He saw his mills not as engines of exploitation, but as a foundation of civilization future. In truth, both perspectives held weight. Carnegie was indeed democratizing access to steel, but he was also building that progress on the backs of a workforce that received little of the benefit. Financially, his success was staggering. Carnegie's steel became so profitable that it dwarfed most other industries, and by the late 1880s his personal fortune was already measured in tens of millions of dollars, equivalent to billions today. He controlled not just production but also distribution, using vertical integration to dominate every step of the process from raw materials to finished rails. He acquired iron ore deposits, coal mines, and shipping lines, ensuring that costs remained under his control. Competitors who tried to undercut him often found themselves unable to match his efficiency, and many were absorbed or driven out of business. The story of steel in Carnegie's era was not only technological but also cultural. Steel transformed the way Americans perceived their nation, feeding a sense of boundless growth and modernity. It became a metaphor for strength, progress, and destiny. Newspapers celebrated the marvels of steel construction, and politicians pointed to industrial output as proof of America's ascendance. At the same time, critics began to speak of robber barons, a term applied to Carnegie and his peers, accusing them of amassing fortunes through ruthless practices while ignoring the plight of workers. Carnegie, ever conscious of public opinion, tried to distinguish himself from other magnates by presenting his wealth as a trust for the people, a responsibility he articulated in his 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth. Yet even as he called upon the rich to give back, he continued to press his mills and managers to squeeze every ounce of efficiency from labor. The paradox of Carnegie's life, philanthropist and exploiter, was never more visible than in the steel years. Internationally, Carnegie's steel positioned the United States as a rising industrial power, rivaling Britain and Germany. American steel fueled expansion abroad, building railroads in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and supplying ships for international trade. By the 1890s, the United States had surpassed Britain as the largest producer of steel, an extraordinary shift in global economic balance that marked the coming of an American century. Carnegie himself became a symbol of this transformation, celebrated in some quarters as a visionary and denounced in others as a tyrant. The success of Carnegie Steel was inseparable from the broader Gilded Age, a period marked by rapid industrialization, staggering wealth for a few, and immense inequality for the many. Steel was both the emblem of progress and the source of discontent, the backbone of modernity and the catalyst for class conflict. For Andrew Carnegie, however, it was a realization of a dream that had begun in the smoke of a Scottish weaving cottage and the dust of an Allegheny mill. He had seized upon a material that embodied the age, and in doing so had secured his place among the titans of industry. The furnaces of Braddock and Homestead did more than produce steel. They forged the contours of the modern world, and at the center of it stood Carnegie, the man who had turned innovation into empire. Steel had built America, and in building it, it had made him one of the wealthiest men alive. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, as Carnegie Steel expanded from the Edgar Thomson Works to additional mills in Homestead, Duquesne, and beyond, the transformation of iron into steel was not only the story of machines and furnaces, but of the thousands of men who bent their bodies and lives to the rhythm of industry, men whose sweat, blood, and sometimes lives were consumed in production of rails, beams, and girders that defined the modern world. The steel mill was unlike any other workplace of the era. It was a place of infernal heat, where blast furnaces roared day and night, their flames visible for miles, and where molten steel glowed like liquid fire as it was poured into molds or rolled into rails. The air was thick with coal smoke and metallic dust, choking lungs and leaving workers with chronic respiratory illnesses. Shifts stretched 12 hours, often 7 days a week, and for many workers, Sunday was not a day of rest, but simply another term before the furnaces. Men collapsed from exhaustion, suffered burns, or lost limbs to unguarded machinery. Death was a constant shadow, sometimes swift in an explosion or collapse, sometimes slow in the toll of long years spent inhaling toxic fumes. Immigrants, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, poured into Pittsburgh and its suburbs to fill these jobs. Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Italians, Croatians, and others joined Irish and German laborers in the mills, forming a workforce as diverse as it was exploited. For many, the steel mill was both a curse and a lifeline. It offered wages higher than farm labor or casual work, but at the cost of safety, health, and dignity. They lived in crowded boarding houses near the mills, their neighborhoods marked by poverty, poor sanitation, and the ever-present soot of Pittsburgh skies. Families relied on the steady wages, but children often grew up fatherless or impoverished when accidents struck. Carnegie himself, far from the factory floor, cultivated a philosophy that appeared contradictory to the lives of his workers. He insisted that efficiency was paramount, that every ton of steel must be produced at the lowest cost possible, and he drove his managers to extract maximum labor for minimum pay. Wages were cut when prices fell, hours were lengthened when demand grew, and the expectation was that workers would endure without complaint. Yet Carnegie also wrote of the virtues of industry, thrift, and eventual uplift, pointing to his own immigrant journey as proof that progress was possible. The men in his mills, however, rarely saw pathways out. They were bound by necessity, their labor enriching a man who they might never meet in person. The conditions in Carnegie's mills were not unique to his operations. They reflected broader patterns of American industrialization. But because Carnegie Steel was the largest and most aggressive producer, its practices set standards across the industry. The relentless drive for efficiency meant that safety improvements were often delayed or ignored. In 1889, for example, the Johnstown flood, caused by the collapse of the South Fork Dam, maintained by a private club that included Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, killed more than 2,200 people, many of them workers and families in the steel town. Though Carnegie was not directly responsible for the dam's failure, the event fueled perceptions that the wealthy magnates lived lives detached from the human consequences of industrial life. Within the mills, the ethos was clear. The product mattered more than the producer. And yet, the men themselves formed bonds of solidarity and resilience. Ethnic groups organized mutual aid societies. Labor unions began to gain footholds, and strikes and protests periodically erupted when conditions became intolerable. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, founded in 1876, sought to represent skilled laborers, negotiating for better pay and conditions, but their influence was often limited by the divisions within the workforce and the fierce resistance of Carnegie's managers. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's partner and later chairman, epitomized this resistance. Frick, who rose from modest origins in the coke industry, believed in crushing unions and maintaining absolute managerial control. Under his leadership, tensions with labor intensified, setting the stage for violent confrontations in the 1890s. For the men on the shop floor, the daily battle was survival. Accounts from workers described the grueling pace, the blinding glare of molten steel, and the ever-present fear of injury. In the rolling mills, where glowing ingots were shaped into rails, workers wielded long tongs and tools, their movements synchronized to avoid disaster. A moment's slip could mean disfigurement or death. In the blast furnaces, men shoveled coke and oil, their skins scorched by radiant heat. In the Bessemer converters, the roar of air blasting through molten iron drowned all conversation, the sight of sparks showering the night both mesmerizing and deadly. It was this world, half inferno, half machine, that earned the steel workers a reputation as men of iron will, yet their humanity was often lost in the statistics of output and profit. Carnegie, writing in later years, spoke of his pride in lowering the cost of steel, making it accessible to society, but for the men whose bodies bore the marks of labor, the cost was measured differently, in broken bones, burned flesh, and shortened lives. Newspapers occasionally reported on accidents, but for the most part, the suffering of steel workers remained invisible to the wider public, overshadowed by the marvels of railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers that labor made possible. Yet within the mills, the seeds of resistance grew. Workers spoke of injustice, of the vast gulf between their wages and the fortunes of men like Carnegie. They debated the promises of socialism, the rights of labor, and the need for collective action. When strikes occurred, they were often met with private security forces, strikebreakers, or local militias, underscoring the imbalance of power. Still, the very fact that such conflicts erupted demonstrated that the workers were not passive victims but active participants in the struggle for dignity. The paradox of Carnegie's empire thus deepened. His name became associated with philanthropy, with libraries, universities, and cultural institutions funded by his fortune. But for the men who produced the steel that financed these gifts, life remained brutal and unforgiving. They were indeed men of steel, forged in the furnaces of industrial America, but they were also men of blood, whose sacrifices underpinned the wealth of an age. The story of Carnegie cannot be told without acknowledging them, for they were the foundation upon which his empire stood. Their lives, often cut short or scarred by labor, remind us that progress in the Gilded Age was not a smooth ascent but a contested, painful process in which human cost was immense. The legacy of these men endures not in monuments or fortune, but in the recognition that the age of steel was also an age of struggle, where the brilliance of industrial achievement was inseparable from the shadows it cast upon those who labored in its flames. By the late 1880s, Andrew Carnegie had achieved what few in history ever would: control over an industry that lay at the heart of modern civilization, a fortune that dwarfed the imagination of his youth, and a reputation both celebrated and despised. Yet as his steel empire grew, so too did the public debate about the moral responsibilities of the wealthy in an age of staggering inequality. It was in this climate that Carnegie penned his most famous and enduring statement of belief, The Gospel of Wealth, published in June 1889 in the North American Review. The essay was not simply a reflection of one man's views, but a manifesto that would shape philanthropy for generations. Carnegie began from the premise that industrial progress had created unprecedented concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few men like himself, but he argued that this was not a curse but a necessary stage of human advancement. Inequality, he contended, was inevitable in a society where innovation and enterprise were rewarded, but the question was what the wealthy would do with their surplus. To Carnegie, the answer was clear. The rich had a duty to use their wealth for the greater good of society, not to pass it on to heirs in indulgence or to let it accumulate idly. He rejected the idea of hoarding wealth, calling it wasteful, and equally dismissed the notion of leaving vast fortunes through inheritance, which he believed weakened families and perpetuated aristocratic privilege. Instead, he insisted that the wealthy must act as trustees of their fortunes, distributing them during their lifetimes for purposes that would uplift the community, particularly through education, libraries, cultural institutions, and scientific advancement. This philosophy was rooted in Carnegie's own experience. He never forgot the Saturday Library of Colonel James Anderson in Allegheny, which had opened the world of books to a poor boy who could never have afforded them. He saw in that act of generosity a model of how opportunity, not charity in the form of handouts, could transform lives. Opportunity meant giving people tools for self-improvement, not relieving them temporarily of hardship. This distinction between philanthropy as empowerment and charity as dependency became central to his philosophy. But the gospel of wealth was also a defense, a justification of his own position in a society that increasingly viewed men like him as rubber barons. The 1880s were marked by bitter strikes, violent labor unrest, and growing criticism of monopolies and trusts. Journalists exposed the excesses of industrial magnates, and politicians debated whether the concentration of wealth posed a danger to democracy. Carnegie sought to reframe the narrative. Yes, inequality was vast, but it was temporary and ultimately beneficial if the wealthy fulfilled their responsibilities. He painted himself not as an exploiter, but as a steward, a man who would dedicate his fortune to the public good. His words were bold, but they also reveal the contradictions at the heart of his life. Even as he spoke of obligation, his mills demanded grueling hours from workers whose wages left them in poverty, whose strikes were often broken by force, and whose lives were shortened by the very industries that enriched him. To critics, the gospel of wealth was less a moral vision than a convenient rationalization, a way for Carnegie to soothe his conscience and burnish his reputation while continuing practices that inflicted suffering. Yet Carnegie was sincere in his conviction, even if blind to its hypocrisies. He believed that his own rise from poverty justified the system, that opportunity existed for others if they had the will to seize it, and that wealth, properly directed, could accelerate the progress of civilization. In practice, Carnegie began to act on his philosophy even before the essay's publication. He funded libraries in small towns across America and Britain, endowing more than 2,500 in total by the end of his life. He established institutions such as the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, later Carnegie Mellon University, and the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, D.C. He funded concert halls, museums, and cultural institutions that remain prominent to this day. His philanthropy was vast, deliberate, and often targeted at projects he believed would have lasting impact rather than short-term relief. The gospel of wealth thus became more than words. It became a program of action that reshaped philanthropy in the United States. Before Carnegie, the wealthy often donated sporadically, leaving gifts and wills or supporting local charities. After Carnegie, philanthropy became strategic, large-scale, and associated with the idea of moral obligation. John D. Rockefeller, though different in temperament, would follow a similar path, institutionalizing philanthropy in ways that still influence global foundations today. Yet the reception of Carnegie's philosophy was mixed. Intellectuals and reformers praised his emphasis on responsibility, while labor leaders condemned it as hypocrisy. Workers in his mills, who earned meager wages and endured dangerous conditions, often scoffed at the idea that their suffering was balanced by libraries they might never have the time to use. The Homestead Strike of 1892, only 3 years after the publication of the Gospel of Wealth, would starkly expose the tension between Carnegie's philosophy and his practices, casting a long shadow over his reputation. Internationally, however, Carnegie's words found resonance. His essay was translated into multiple languages, and in Europe he was celebrated as a modern philosopher of wealth. In Britain, his donations to libraries and educational institutions won admiration, and he became a symbol of the immigrant who gave back to both his native and adopted lands. For Carnegie personally, the gospel of wealth was not only a declaration of duty but also a statement of identity. He saw himself as a bridge between classes, a man who had lived in poverty and now in wealth, uniquely positioned to understand both. He argued that wealth should not isolate the rich but connect them to the broader human community through acts of responsibility. In this sense, the essay reflected not just an abstract philosophy but the arc of his own life, from bobbin boy to steel magnate to would-be benefactor of humanity. The legacy of the gospel of wealth has endured because it articulated questions that remain relevant. What obligations do the wealthy have to society? Should philanthropy be a substitute for systemic reform? Does giving back erase the harm done in acquiring wealth? Carnegie's answers were rooted in the optimism of the Gilded Age, in a belief that progress was inevitable and that men of vision could guide it. But history has judged him more ambiguously, recognizing both the transformative impact of his philanthropy and the undeniable exploitation of his workers. What cannot be denied is that in 1889, with the publication of the Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie crystallized a philosophy that both defined his life and reshaped the role of wealth in modern society, setting a precedent that continues to influence debates about inequality and responsibility to this day. By the late 1880s, as Carnegie steel reached the height of its dominance in the American industrial landscape, Andrew Carnegie increasingly relied upon a partner whose reputation for toughness, efficiency, and ruthless resolve would shape both the company's operations and its darkest conflicts. Henry Clay Frick, born in 1849 in rural Pennsylvania. Frick was nearly a generation younger than Carnegie, But his rise mirrored in some ways the trajectory of America's Gilded Age industrialists. He began not in steel but in coke, the purified form of coal essential to fueling blast furnaces. In his early 20s, Frick recognized that western Pennsylvania's Connellsville region possessed vast reserves of coal perfectly suited for coke production, and he systematically bought up land, establishing the H.C. Frick Coke Company. By the early 1880s, he controlled thousands of coke ovens and had secured himself as a dominant supplier in the industry. This command of a critical raw material brought him into contact with Carnegie, who needed reliable supplies of coke to fuel his steel empire. Their business relationship quickly deepened, for Carnegie saw in Frick not just a supplier but a manager who embodied the traits Carnegie prized: unrelenting focus on efficiency, intolerance for waste, and a willingness to make hard decisions without hesitation. In 1882, Carnegie invited Frick into partnership, and by the late 1880s, Frick was not only running the coke operations but also managing day-to-day operations of Carnegie Steel. While Carnegie remained a visionary, often traveling abroad and writing about philosophy and philanthropy, Frick became the enforcer, the man on the ground in Pittsburgh whose word was law inside the mills. The partnership were productive but fraught with tension. Carnegie and Frick were opposites in temperament. Carnegie cultivated an image of benevolence, quoting philosophy and speaking of responsibility, while Frick projected an aura of cold pragmatism, dismissing sentimentality as weakness. Where Carnegie preferred persuasion and public relations, Frick relied on discipline and force. Workers who hoped for concessions from Carnegie often found themselves dealing instead with Frick's iron hand, and it was Frick's policies that deepened hostility between labor and management. Yet Carnegie needed him. The expansion of the steel empire required someone willing to make unpopular decisions, to cut wages, to speed production, and to keep unions in check, and Frick excelled in all these areas. Under his management, Carnegie Steel became even more efficient, more profitable, and more feared. The mills at Homestead, Duquesne, and Braddock were run with military precision, every detail scrutinized for cost savings, every inefficiency rooted out. Frick oversaw massive reinvestments in machinery, adopting the open hearth process and expanding capacity until Carnegie Steel's output exceeded that of entire nations. He negotiated with railroads, secured new sources of raw materials, and built up reserves of coke and iron ore to weather market fluctuations. By the early 1890s, Carnegie Steel was not only the largest steel producer in America, but also the most technologically advanced, thanks in no small measure to Frick's relentless drive. But with this efficiency came resentment. Workers bristled under long hours, dangerous conditions, and declining real wages. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest labor unions of the era, clashed repeatedly with Carnegie Steel, and Frick's stance was uncompromising. Unions were a threat to managerial control, and he was determined to break them. This conflict would culminate in the infamous Homestead Strike of 1892, one of the most violent labor confrontations in American history. But even before that flashpoint, Frick had established a reputation as the most feared figure in Pittsburgh industry. He lived in a mansion on Fifth Avenue in Pittsburgh, a fortress-like residence that symbolized both his wealth and his isolation from the working-class neighborhoods that surrounded the mills. Inside, he curated fine art and hosted elite guests, while outside, workers labored in conditions he insisted were necessary for efficiency. The contrast between his personal luxury and the deprivation of his employees was stark, feeding public perception of industrialists as detached from the realities of labor. Carnegie, often in Scotland or New York, left Frick to absorb much of the hostility, maintaining his own image as a benefactor while his partner bore the brunt of labor's anger. Yet their relationship was not without strain. Carnegie admired Frick's effectiveness, but often recoiled at his bluntness and lack of diplomacy. Frick, in turn, saw Carnegie as hypocritical, cloaking ruthless business practices in the language of morality and philanthropy. Their letters reveal a mix of respect and irritation, as each man recognized the other's indispensability, but bristled at the differences in character. Over time, these tensions would explode into outright hostility, but during the peak years of Carnegie Steel's expansion, their partnership was essential. Together they built an empire that dwarfed competitors, producing steel at prices no rival could match, supplying railroads, skyscrapers, and bridges across the nation. The fortress they constructed was not merely physical but institutional, a dominance that reshaped American industry. Yet the fortress was also fragile, built on the backs of workers whose discontent grew more volatile with each wage cut and each accident unaddressed. Frick's role in this era illustrates the dual nature of industrial power, the capacity to create wealth and progress on an unprecedented scale, and the capacity to inflict suffering and deepen inequality. Without Frick, Carnegie Steel might not have achieved its commanding position, but with him, it also became a symbol of industrial tyranny. The partnership of Carnegie and Frick thus embodied the contradictions of the Gilded Age itself, an age of soaring achievement and bitter conflict, of fortunes built on innovation and enforced by the blood of labor. For Carnegie, Frick was a fortress that secured his empire. For the workers, he was a face of oppression. And for history, he remains a reminder that progress is often accompanied by shadows as deep as its triumphs are bright. In the summer of 1892, the uneasy partnership between Andrew Carnegie's philosophy of benevolence and Henry Clay Frick's iron-handed management collided with a rising militancy of American labor, producing one of the most violent and infamous episodes of the Gilded Age, the Homestead Strike. The Homestead Steel Works, located along the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, had become one of Carnegie Steel's crown jewels, a vast complex of furnaces, rolling mills, and workshops employing thousands of men who turned out rails and beams that powered America's growth. Yet beneath the clamor of machinery and the glow of molten steel, tensions had simmered for years. Skilled workers at Homestead were organized under the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest trade unions of the time, which had successfully negotiated favorable contracts in the past. They prided themselves on their craft and resisted management's attempt to dilute their control by cutting wages or expanding reliance on unskilled immigrant labor. For Carnegie, who was abroad in Scotland in 1892, the union posed an obstacle to his vision of efficiency and cost control. For Frick, left in charge, the union was intolerable, a threat to managerial authority that had to be crushed. As a 3-year contract between the Amalgamated Association and Carnegie Steel approached expiration on June 30th, 1892, Frick prepared for confrontation. He announced sweeping wage cuts that would reduce pay by as much as 26% for many skilled workers, arguing that falling steel prices necessitated cuts. The union rejected the proposal, insisting that the company's profits remained enormous and that the reductions were unjust. Negotiations collapsed, and Frick resolved to break the union entirely. He fortified the mill like a fortress, erecting a 3-mile-long fence topped with barbed wire around the Homestead plant, quickly nicknamed Fort Frick. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents, armed private security men known for their willingness to use violence against strikers, and brought them by barges up the river under cover of darkness on July 6th. The workers, however, were prepared. Thousands had gathered, supported by their families and townspeople, determined to resist the takeover. As the Pinkertons attempted to land, they were met with armed resistance. A fierce battle erupted along the riverbank, lasting nearly an entire day. Gunfire cracked, dynamite was thrown, and the river itself became a battleground as the Pinkertons tried to push ashore. When the smoke cleared, at least 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons lay dead, and scores were wounded. Blood stained the waters of the Monongahela, and the name Homestead entered history as a symbol of class warfare. Ultimately, the Pinkertons surrendered, humiliated and battered, but the victory was short-lived for the workers. The Pennsylvania governor, responding to pressure from Carnegie Steel and the alarmed business community, dispatched 8,000 state militiamen to occupy the town and seize control of the mill. With soldiers guarding the plant, Frick reopened operations using strike breakers, many of them immigrants desperate for work, under heavy military protection. The strike dragged on for months, but starvation and division eventually forced the workers to concede defeat. By November, the Amalgamated Association had been broken at Homestead, its power shattered, and Carnegie Steel had reasserted absolute control. The consequences of the Homestead Strike reverberated far beyond Pittsburgh. Public opinion, at first sympathetic to the workers after the violent clash with the Pinkertons, shifted as anarchists attempted to assassinate Frick in his Pittsburgh office only weeks later. On July 23rd, Alexander Borkman, a Russian-born anarchist unaffiliated with the Union, entered Frick's office and shot him twice at close range before stabbing him repeatedly with a knife. Miraculously, Frick survived, refusing medical attention until he had finished dictating correspondence, an act that cemented his image as a man of iron will. Yet the assassination attempt undermined the workers' cause, allowing the company and press to portray the strike as radical and lawless. For Carnegie, safely ensconced at his Scottish estate, the episode was a personal and reputational disaster. He had instructed Frick privately to deal firmly with the Union, but hoped publicly to maintain his image as a friend of the working man. When the violence erupted, critics accused him of hypocrisy, of hiding behind philanthropy while profiting from bloodshed. He would spend the rest of his life attempting to distance himself from Homestead, but the stain never disappeared. The strike also marked a turning point in American labor history. The defeat of the Amalgamated Association at Homestead crippled the steelworkers' union movement for decades, signaling the ascendancy of industrial capital over organized labor in heavy industry. The use of private security forces, state militia, and strikebreakers became a model for other corporations, and the dream of collective bargaining in steel was crushed until the New Deal era in the 1930s. Homestead revealed the deep contradictions of the Gilded Age, a nation celebrating progress, technology, and wealth, while tolerating the violent oppression of those who produced it. It exposed the gulf between Carnegie's lofty words and the gospel of wealth and the lived experience of his workers, whose demands for dignity were met with bullets. For the men and families of Homestead, the legacy was one of loss of wages, loss of lives, and loss of faith in the possibility of justice. For Carnegie, it was a shadow that darkened his later years, no matter how many libraries he built or how many millions he gave away. And for America, it was a warning that the steel which built its bridges and skyscrapers was tempered not only in furnaces but in the blood of workers who dared to resist. By the mid-1890s, in the aftermath of the Homestead Strike, and despite the stain it left on his reputation, Andrew Carnegie presided over the most powerful steel empire in the world, a corporate giant that embodied both the triumphs and contradictions of the Gilded Age. Carnegie Steel, headquartered in Pittsburgh, operated not only the Edgar Thomson Works and the Voss Homestead Mill, but also integrated plants in Duquesne, Braddock, and Clairton, supported by a network of iron ore mines in Minnesota, coal fields in Pennsylvania, coke ovens in Connellsville, and rail and shipping lines that carried raw materials to the mills and finished rails, beams, and plates across the nation. Through vertical integration, Carnegie controlled every step of production, ensuring that no competitor could undercut his costs, and through economies of scale, he turned steel into a commodity affordable to railroads, builders, and manufacturers at prices once unimaginable. By 1897, the company, with producing more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain, long considered the world's industrial leader, and by 1900, Carnegie Steel alone accounted for nearly a quarter of all American steel output. The numbers were staggering. Profits reached into the tens of millions annually, with output measured in millions of tons, and the company's efficiency made it the envy of global industry. Railroads laid Carnegie Steel across the continent. Bridges spanned rivers that once divided regions. Skyscrapers rose from Chicago to New York, and American warships carried his steel on their hulls. To admirers, Carnegie embodied the American dream, an immigrant boy who had risen from a Scottish weaver's cottage to command an empire of steel. To critics, he was the ultimate robber baron, a man who cloaked ruthless practices in the rhetoric of philanthropy. Yet there was no denying that by the turn of the century, his empire stood at its peak, unmatched in size, scope, and influence. Carnegie himself, often abroad in Scotland or at his mansion in New York, continued to write essays extolling the virtues of progress and philanthropy, but the day-to-day operation of the empire rested increasingly with Henry Clay Frick and other managers who enforced discipline with an iron hand. After Homestead, the company had effectively broken organized labor in steel. Unions were powerless, and wages remained low, even as output soared. 12-hour shifts and 7-day weeks became the standard, extracting maximum productivity from a workforce that had little recourse but to endure. Safety remained secondary to efficiency, and casualties in the mills were frequent, yet production records eclipsed all else in the eyes of management. Still, the innovations of Carnegie Steel were undeniable. The company expanded the use of the open-hearth furnace, which allowed greater flexibility in producing steel of different grades, and invested heavily in research and development. Carnegie insisted on reinvesting profits into machinery and plant improvements rather than distributing large dividends, a policy that kept the company ahead of rivals. He also maintained a network of trusted partners and investors, often drawn from his Scottish immigrant circle, who provided stability and capital. At its peak, Carnegie Steel was not merely a business but a system, a tightly controlled industrial organism that anticipated many features of modern corporations. Yet Carnegie's empire was not only about steel, it was also about power. His fortune gave him influence in politics, though he preferred to remain behind the scenes rather than hold office. His essays and speeches, widely reprinted, made him a public intellectual of sorts, arguing for peace, education, and philanthropy. He cultivated relationships with presidents, prime ministers, and industrial leaders across Europe and America, presenting himself as a bridge between the old world and the new. But beneath this cultivated image, rivalries brewed. His relationship with Frick deteriorated into open hostility, culminating in a bitter split in the late 1890s after disputes over management style, strategy, and personal animosity. Carnegie, who prided himself on moral superiority, never forgave Frick for the bloodshed at Homestead, while Frick, equally stubborn, despised Carnegie's hypocrisy in preaching benevolence while profiting from ruthless practices. Their feud became legendary, with exchanges of insults and legal battles that underscored the fragility of Carnegie's empire at its peak. Still, the empire endured, powered by the insatiable demand for steel in a nation whose growth seemed boundless. The Spanish-American War of 1898, brief though it was, highlighted steel's strategic importance as American warships and artillery relied on Carnegie's product, further enhancing the company's stature. Meanwhile, urbanization and industrialization created constant demand for steel rails, girders, and plates, and Carnegie's mills churned day and night to meet it. By 1900, Carnegie himself was approaching retirement age, increasingly drawn to the idea of selling his empire and devoting his remaining years to philanthropy. But in that moment, at the turn of the century, Carnegie Steel represented the pinnacle of industrial capitalism, a corporation that had reshaped America's economy, society, and landscape. Its empire of furnaces and mills symbolized both progress and exploitation, innovation and inequality, triumph and tragedy. For Andrew Carnegie, it was a realization of a dream begun in poverty, a dream that had lifted him to heights of wealth few had ever known. For his workers, it was a fortress of labor that consumed their bodies and left them with little share in the riches they created. And for history, the empire at its peak was a reminder that industrial greatness often came at immense human cost. At the dawn of the 20th century, Andrew Carnegie stood as the unrivaled master of steel, yet even as his empire reached unprecedented heights, he contemplated an exit that would astonish the world, the sale of Carnegie Steel. By 1900, Carnegie was in his mid-60s, his fortune vast, his reputation paradoxical, and his ambitions shifting increasingly toward philanthropy rather than further conquest of industry. The idea of selling had been whispered for years, But now the conditions aligned. The United States, fresh from victory in the Spanish-American War, was flexing its muscles as a global power, and steel lay at the core of its strength. Railroads, bridges, skyscrapers, and warships all depended upon it, and Carnegie's empire were producing more steel than all of Great Britain combined. At the same time, Wall Street was moving toward a new phase of corporate consolidation, led by financiers who believed that the future lay not in competing firms, but in giant trusts that could dominate markets and stabilize prices. At the center of this transformation stood John Pierpont Morgan, the formidable banker whose power and influence rivaled that of governments. Morgan had already consolidated railroads and electrical companies into massive corporations, and now he turned his gaze toward steel. He believed that the creation of a single, dominant steel company would not only control the market but also symbolize America's maturity as an industrial power. For Morgan, Carnegie was a final obstacle. For Carnegie, Morgan was the instrument through which he could secure both an extraordinary fortune and freedom to pursue his philanthropic vision. The negotiations that followed became legendary. Carnegie, while in Scotland in 1900, scribbled on a slip of paper the price at which he would sell, $480 million for his vast empire. It was a staggering sum, equivalent to tens of billions today, and even Carnegie himself seemed almost amused by the audacity of the number. Yet when the offer reached Morgan, the banker did not flinch. "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie," he is reported to have said. "You are now the richest man in the world." The deal was finalized in 1901, when Morgan purchased Carnegie Steel and merged it with several other companies to create United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. At its birth, U.S. Steel controlled a third of American steel production, employed over 170,000 workers, and stood as the largest industrial enterprise ever created. For Carnegie, the sale represented the culmination of a lifetime's ambition. He had risen from poverty, mastered industry, and now converted his empire into cash and securities that made him, for a time, the wealthiest individual on earth. Yet he felt no regret in letting it go. Indeed, he seemed relieved. To friends, he declared that he had spent the first half of his life making money and would spend the second half giving it away. For Morgan, the acquisition cemented his status as the architect of American capitalism, the man who could summon capital on a scale rivaling governments and direct the flow of entire industries. But the sale also symbolized something larger. The transformation of American industry from entrepreneurial empires built by individuals to corporate behemoths managed by boards, shareholders, and financiers. The age of Carnegie, the industrialist, gave way to the age of corporate capitalism. The reaction to the deal was mixed. Newspapers marveled at the sheer scale of the transaction, calling it a milestone in the history of business. Admirers praised Carnegie for his vision in recognizing the value of consolidation, while critics condemned the creation of yet another monopoly that would squeeze consumers and workers alike. For laborers, little change, long hours and low wages persisted under U.S. Steel just as under Carnegie Steel. For Carnegie, however, the sale allowed him to pursue philanthropy without distraction, pouring hundreds of millions into libraries, universities, cultural institutions, and foundations. The transaction also laid bare the gulf between Carnegie's philosophy and Morgan's. Where Carnegie spoke of wealth as a trust to be used for the public good, Morgan saw wealth as power to be organized and controlled. Their partnership in this deal was brief but emblematic of the Gilded Age's dual legacies: industrial innovation and financial consolidation, entrepreneurship and monopoly. The sale to Morgan also marked the final act in Carnegie's rivalry with Frick. Though estranged, both men became fabulously wealthy from the transaction, and yet their personal bitterness endured, with each refusing reconciliation. For Carnegie, wealth was now no longer a means of expansion but a tool for legacy. For Frick, the fortune was proof of vindication, even if he despised his former partner. In the broader history of capitalism, the The creation of U.S. Steel signaled the arrival of corporations so large and powerful that they rivaled nations. It was a new era, one in which finance and management replaced individual visionaries as the engines of industry. Yet none of it would have been possible without Carnegie's relentless pursuit of efficiency, scale, and reinvestment. The empire he built became the foundation upon which Morgan constructed his colossus. In selling steel, Carnegie not only made himself the richest man alive, but also handed the torch of industrial power to a new generation of corporate capitalists. For America, the sale was both triumph and warning. A triumph of industrial might that confirmed a nation's global ascendancy, and a warning of the dangers of concentrated corporate power that would dominate debates for decades to come. For Andrew Carnegie, it was liberation. The immigrant boy from Dunfermline, once a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, had conquered industry, sold it for a fortune beyond imagination, and prepared to spend the rest of his life proving that wealth, in his words, was only justified when used to uplift humanity. When Andrew Carnegie sold his empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for the staggering sum of $480 million, he did not merely retire from business. He embarked on what he saw as the second, more important half of his life, the purposeful distribution of wealth for the betterment of humanity, having declared in the Gospel of Wealth that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Carnegie took upon himself the task of proving his philosophy through action, becoming the most prolific philanthropist the world had yet seen. The sale left him personally worth more than $300 million after taxes and adjustments, an amount so vast it exceeded the entire U.S. federal budget of some years in the 19th century, and he resolved not to let it remain idle. Instead, he envisioned a systematic program of giving that would outlast him, create institutions of enduring value, and provide opportunities for generations to come. His first great passion was libraries. Remembering the doors opened to him by Colonel James Anderson's small collection in Pittsburgh, Carnegie believed that free access to books was the foundation of self-improvement. Beginning modestly in the 1880s, his library program exploded after 1901. Over the next 2 decades, he funded the construction of more than 2,500 libraries across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and beyond. From bustling cities to small towns that might never otherwise have afforded such facilities. His grants typically required local governments to provide the land and commit to maintaining the libraries with tax funds, ensuring sustainability and local investment. The distinctive Carnegie libraries, with their broad steps, arched entrances, and sturdy stone construction, became landmarks of civic pride and symbols of knowledge made accessible to all. Beyond libraries, Carnegie turned his attention to education more broadly. In 1900, even before the sale of Carnegie Steel, he had founded the Carnegie Technical Schools in Pittsburgh, later to become Carnegie Mellon University, a pioneering institution that combined technical training with academic rigor, reflecting his belief that modern society required both practical skills and intellectual grounding. He endowed universities across America and Britain, including the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, D.C., which funded scientific research, and the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, supporting students in his homeland. These gifts reflected his conviction that education was a key to progress, a means by which individuals could rise, just as he had, from humble origins. Carnegie's philanthropy extended to culture as well. He funded Carnegie Hall in New York City, which opened in 1891 and quickly became one of the world's premier concert venues. He supported museums, art galleries, and cultural institutions, believing that exposure to beauty and art enriched society and elevated the human spirit. His generosity reached into peace initiatives as well. Haunted by the carnage of the Civil War and later appalled by the growing militarism of Europe, he became a passionate advocate for international arbitration. He endowed the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910, established the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and financed the construction of the Peace Palace at The Hague, intended as a permanent home for resolving international disputes. These initiatives underscored his belief that wealth should not only uplift individuals but also prevent humanity from descending into destruction. Yet Carnegie's philanthropy was not without controversy. Critics argued that his gifts, though vast, could not erase the suffering endured by workers in his mills. Labor leaders charged that libraries did little for men maimed in steel accidents or for widows of those killed on the job. Some saw his philanthropy as a grand gesture to cleanse his conscience, a way to immortalize his name while avoiding responsibility for the brutal realities of industrial capitalism. Carnegie, however, saw no contradiction. He argued that providing opportunity for education and self-betterment was the truest form of assistance, enabling future generations to rise above the hardships that his own workers had endured. He insisted that his fortune was a trust, not for his family. His daughter Margaret received only a modest portion compared to his public gifts, but for humanity at large. In practice, Carnegie gave away over $350 million during his lifetime, the vast majority of his fortune, an unprecedented scale of philanthropy in that era. The institutions he founded continued to shape education, science, and culture more than a century later, a testament to the enduring impact of his vision. Yet the image of Carnegie as benefactor coexisted uneasily with the memory of Carnegie as industrialist. The Homestead Strike, the long hours, and the poverty of steel workers remained part of his legacy, a reminder that his philanthropy was funded by profits extracted from labor under harsh conditions. This paradox defined his final decades, lionized as the world's greatest philanthropist, criticized as a man whose fortune had been built on exploitation. Carnegie himself appeared untroubled by the contradiction. He spoke often of peace, learning, and progress, and in his final years he wrote extensively, crafting an image of himself as a philosopher of wealth and human betterment. To his admirers, he embodied the possibility that capitalism could be redeemed through generosity. To his detractors, he exemplified the moral compromises of the Gilded Age. But there was no denying that with the sale of his empire and his subsequent philanthropy, Carnegie had transformed himself from tycoon to benefactor, from captain of industry to patron of humanity. The boy who once borrowed books in Allegheny had become the man who gave books to the world. His fortune, forged in steel, was recast in libraries, universities, and institutions of peace, ensuring that his name would endure not only in business history but in the fabric of culture and education across the globe. Among all of Andrew Carnegie's philanthropic endeavors, none became so closely identified with his name, nor so transformative in its impact, as his vast program of library building, a campaign that spread across continents and reshaped the very idea of public access to knowledge. To Carnegie, libraries were not luxuries but necessities of civilization, instruments by which ordinary people could rise through effort and education. The idea had taken root in his youth, when as a poor boy in Allegheny he gained access to Colonel James Anderson's small private library, borrowing volumes that opened horizons far beyond the cotton mill and the telegraph office. That early experience convinced him that the most effective gift the wealthy could give was not charity to relieve temporary needs, but access to tools of self-improvement. And in his mind, nothing embodied that principle more perfectly than a free library. Carnegie began modestly in the 1880s, funding libraries in his hometown of Dunfermline, Scotland, and in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. But after selling Carnegie Steel in 1901, his efforts expanded into a global campaign. By the time of his death in 1919, he had funded the construction of more than 2,500 libraries worldwide, including nearly 1,700 in the United States, 660 in Britain and Ireland, 125 in Canada, and dozens scattered across Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, and even Fiji. His approach was distinctive. Rather than simply building libraries outright, Carnegie required local governments to provide land, contribute tax funds for ongoing maintenance, and demonstrate community commitment. His grants paid for construction, but sustainability depended on local investment. This model ensured that the libraries were not isolated gifts but integrated into civic life, binding communities to their upkeep and use. Architecturally, Carnegie libraries became iconic. Though designs varied, they often featured broad steps leading to grand entrances, symbolizing the climb toward knowledge, with reading rooms filled with natural light and open stacks that allowed patrons to browse freely, a departure from earlier libraries where books were locked away and accessible only through intermediaries. For millions of ordinary people, these libraries were the first places where they could sit in quiet, borrow books without cost, and pursue learning at their own pace. In small towns across America, the arrival of a Carnegie library was an event of civic pride, celebrated with parades and speeches, its stone walls standing as monuments of belief that knowledge was as essential as commerce or governance. In larger cities, Carnegie libraries became cultural centers, offering lectures, art exhibitions, and meeting spaces alongside books. The social impact was profound. Immigrants used them to learn English. Students used them to pursue studies beyond what their schools offered. Workers used them to expand skills, and reformers used them as spaces of discussion and organizing. Carnegie's libraries democratized access to knowledge in an era before widespread public schooling, and long before the internet. They also standardized the expectation that libraries should be public, free, and supported by government, an idea that has since become a cornerstone of modern civic life. Yet the library program, like much of Carnegie's legacy, was not without critics. Some argued that communities burdened by poverty should not be forced to assume maintenance costs for buildings they could afford to sustain. Others charged that Carnegie's philanthropy was built on the blood of steelworkers, that libraries could not compensate for lives lost in mills or strikes. Labor leaders mocked the idea that a 12-hour steelworker would have the time or energy to read in the evenings. Carnegie responded that his philanthropy was not meant to relieve immediate suffering, but to create opportunities for future generations. He believed passionately that knowledge could break cycles of poverty, just as it had lifted him. To him, every library represented a chance for another immigrant boy to find a path upward. The numbers tell part of the story. By 1920, Carnegie libraries accounted for nearly half of all public libraries in the United States, and their presence vastly expanded the reach of literacy and education. Many continue to operate today, their original stone buildings still serving communities more than a century after they were built. Beyond their practical impact, they reshaped the cultural landscape, embedding the expectation that knowledge should be universally accessible, not reserved for elites. Internationally, Carnegie's libraries extended his philosophy across the English-speaking world and beyond, reinforcing his vision of a global community bound by learning. In Scotland, his gift symbolized a son giving back to the land of his birth. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they reinforced ties within the British Empire while promoting local civic development. Even in small, remote towns, the presence of a Carnegie library connected communities to a larger vision of progress and modernity. The legacy of Carnegie's libraries is perhaps the most enduring of his philanthropy because it combined practical utility with symbolic power. They stood as temples of knowledge, open to all, embodying the principle that learning was not the privilege of few but the right of every citizen. They linked the immigrant experience of striving for advancement with the democratic ideal of equal opportunity. They also enshrined Carnegie's belief that wealth should be used not to indulge heirs or perpetuate aristocracy, but to empower the masses through education. Today, debates continue about Carnegie's legacy, about whether philanthropy can ever erase the injustices of wealth accumulation, about whether libraries or institutions funded by great fortunes represent generosity or self-glorification. But few would deny that the libraries transformed lives. Generations of children discovered books in their holes. Generations of workers broadened their horizons. And generations of communities rallied around the belief that knowledge was worth the investment. In the grand arc of Carnegie's life, the libraries may stand as his truest monument, more lasting than mills or fortunes, for they embodied his deepest conviction, that the road from rags to riches, from ignorance to opportunity, could be paved not by charity alone but by access to knowledge. Even as Andrew Carnegie poured unprecedented sums into libraries, universities, scientific institutions, and cultural holes, he could never escape the chorus of critics who insisted that his philanthropy, however grand, was built upon foundations of blood and exploitation, and that no number of books or buildings could wash away the injustices of his rise. To many workers and reformers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Carnegie and men like him were not benefactors but enemies of the people, symbols of a system that concentrated wealth in the hands of few while demanding endless toil from the many. The Homestead Strike of 1892 remained a scar that no library dedication could erase. For labor organizers, the memory of dead workers on the Monongahela River was proof that Carnegie's benevolence was a mask over ruthless capitalism. Even sympathetic observers struggled with the contradiction. How could a man who preached the virtues of peace and education preside over mills that demanded 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, for wages that barely sustained life? How could the same fortune that funded orchestras and scientific research be accumulated by cutting pay and crushing unions? Journalists and intellectuals of the progressive era increasingly challenged the notion that private philanthropy could substitute for systemic reform. Critics like Ida Tarbell and other muckrakers argued that philanthropy allowed industrialists to dictate social priorities, shaping education and culture according to their own taste rather than democratic decision-making. Labor leaders dismissed Carnegie's libraries as irrelevant to men who returned home from 14-hour shifts too exhausted to read. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist leader, condemned industrial magnates for seeking redemption through philanthropy while continuing to oppose labor rights. Even within immigrant communities, there was ambivalence. While many celebrated the arrival of a Carnegie library, they also recognized that the same money came from mills that consumed the lives of their fathers, brothers, and sons. The paradox was visible in Pittsburgh itself, where grand cultural institutions funded by Carnegie stood only miles from soot-blackened neighborhoods where steel workers lived in poverty. For Carnegie, such criticism was both infuriating and motivating. He insisted that his philanthropy was not about absolution but about responsibility, that he had always believed wealth must be used for the benefit of society. He pointed to the enduring value of libraries, universities, and scientific research, contrasting them with fleeting wages or temporary relief. In his view, philanthropy was about building ladders of opportunity, not distributing alms. Yet the moral tension remained. Critics asked whether it was just that decisions about education, culture, and peace should rest on the will of one man, however generous, rather than on democratic consensus. Others saw his philanthropy as self-glorification, a way to immortalize his name in stone. Indeed, many of his institutions bore the Carnegie name, ensuring that future generations would remember him not for Homestead but for learning and culture. Even his Peace Palace in The Hague, dedicated in 1913 as a monument to international arbitration, could not escape irony when the First World War erupted the following year, plunging Europe into unprecedented slaughter despite Carnegie's dreams. For reformers, the failure of philanthropy to prevent such horrors underscored its limits. The critique of Carnegie's philanthropy also reflected larger debates of the progressive era about inequality, democracy, and the role of the state. While some admired the generosity of industrialists, others argued that true justice required regulation, taxation, and labor rights, not the discretionary largesse of millionaires. In this sense, Carnegie became a lightning rod for deeper questions about the moral foundations of capitalism itself. Yet despite criticism, his philanthropy endured and expanded, reshaping civic life in ways that even his opponents acknowledged. Libraries were built, students were funded, research was advanced, and peace movements were supported. The contradiction between the source of his wealth and its uses did not negate the reality of its impact, but it ensured that Carnegie's legacy would always be contested. Was he a benefactor who redeemed capitalism through generosity, or a robber baron who sought to cleanse his conscience with monuments? The answer, perhaps, is both. For the steel workers of Homestead, he remained a symbol of betrayal. For generations of students and readers, he became a patron of opportunity. The tension between these perspectives defined his place in history. What cannot be denied is that Carnegie forced society to confront questions that remain urgent. Can philanthropy justify inequality? Can private wealth be trusted to serve the public good? Or must democracy itself assume the responsibility of shaping opportunity? These debates, ignited in the age of Carnegie, continue into the present, ensuring that his name, whether praised or condemned, endures as a symbol of the paradoxes of wealth, power, and responsibility. In the years after selling his steel empire, Andrew Carnegie increasingly turned his attention not only to education, culture, but to what he considered the greatest cause of all, the abolition of war itself. To Carnegie, who had seen the carnage of the American Civil War and who recognized that the new industrial age had given nations weapons of unprecedented destructive power, war was not only barbaric but an obstacle to the progress of civilization. He believed passionately that just as men of industry had conquered nature through science and innovation, so too could humanity conquer its own tendency toward conflict through reason, arbitration, and international cooperation. From the early 1900s until the outbreak of World War I, Carnegie invested enormous sums, energy, and personal prestige into the peace movement, becoming one of the world's most visible advocates for international harmony. His belief was rooted partly in idealism and partly in pragmatism. He saw war as wasteful, destroying wealth that could be used for libraries, schools, and progress, and he argued that arbitration courts and treaties could provide a rational alternative. In 1903, he established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, endowing it with $10 million to promote dialogue, research, and policy aimed at replacing conflict with negotiation. He recruited leading intellectuals and diplomats to its board, envisioning it as a kind of permanent engine for peace. His greatest project, however, was a peace palace at The Hague in the Netherlands, a monumental building designed to house a permanent court of arbitration. Funded largely by Carnegie's gift of $1.5 million, the Peace Palace opened in 1913 as a symbol of hope. Its grand halls and marble chambers meant to serve as a courtroom where nations would settle disputes through law rather than war. At its dedication, Carnegie himself declared that the building would be the most holy temple the world has yet erected to the abolition of war. He spoke with optimism that the age of armed conflict was giving way to an age of reason, much as the age of superstition had given way to science. Carnegie's peace efforts extended beyond institutions. He published widely on the subject, writing essays and books that condemned militarism and celebrated arbitration. He personally lobbied world leaders, from Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany to American Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, urging them to embrace disarmament and treaties of peace. He funded peace congresses and supported organizations that sought to educate the public about the costs of war. His enthusiasm was boundless, at times bordering on naïve. He believed that humanity stood on the brink of a new era, that the horrors of the past would give way to enlightened cooperation. His optimism was fueled by the growing network of treaties and arbitration agreements signed in the early 20th century, and he convinced himself that the great powers were moving inexorably toward peace. Yet reality was less cooperative. The same industrial progress that had enriched Carnegie also fueled an arms race among nations. Battleships of steel, artillery of enormous power, and armies of millions were being prepared in Europe, driven by nationalism, imperial rivalry, and alliances. Critics of Carnegie's peace crusade dismiss it as utopian, arguing that human ambition and rivalry could not be erased by treaties alone. Still, Carnegie persisted, pouring resources into the cause with the same intensity he once devoted to steel. He even envisioned a League of Peace, a precursor to what would later become the League of Nations, in which countries would pledge to defend one another against aggressors and resolve disputes through arbitration. For Carnegie personally, the peace movement became a central part of his identity. He referred to it as his chief happiness, and believed that his fortune would achieve its noblest purpose if it helped end war. He often spoke of the Peace Palace as his true monument, greater than libraries or universities, because it represented the possibility of saving millions of lives. But in 1914, the illusion collapsed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations that plunged Europe into the First World War. Within weeks, the continent Carnegie believed was on the verge of peace erupted into total war, the very kind he had most feared. Industrialized slaughter, artillery, machine guns, poison gas, and steel warships turned battlefields into killing fields. By the war's end, more than 16 million people were dead, empires lay in ruins, and the Peace Palace itself stood as a bitter reminder of failed hopes. For Carnegie, already an old man in his late 70s, the outbreak of war was devastating. He fell into despair, withdrawing from public life. Friends described him as broken, unable to reconcile his lifelong dream of peace with the reality of unprecedented carnage. He had given his fortune, his energy, and his belief to the cause, only to see the world plunge into catastrophe. His writings in these years became increasingly mournful, reflecting a man disillusioned but not entirely defeated. He clung to the hope that after the war, humanity would finally recognize the futility of conflict and embrace permanent peace. In this sense, his vision lived on in the League of Nations, founded after the war as part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points, though Carnegie himself did not live to see its creation in 1920. The irony of Carnegie's peace crusade is central to his legacy. He believed that wealth could redeem industry's violence, that reason could tame nationalism, and that treaties could replace arms. He was wrong in his timing, but not in his aspiration. His Peace Palace still stands today, housing the International Court of Justice, a reminder that while war has not been abolished, the structures he helped create continue to shape global efforts toward law and arbitration. For history, Carnegie's peace dream illustrates both the power and the limits of philanthropy, the way one man's fortune could build institutions but not erase the deeper forces of politics and human conflict. For Carnegie himself, it was a defining disappointment of his final years, the dream before war that became a nightmare. He had imagined a world bound together by knowledge and peace, but he lived long enough to see that world shatter in the thunder of guns. By the time the guns of Europe thundered in 1914, Andrew Carnegie was already in his late 70s, his once boundless energy dim but not extinguished, and the world he had worked so tirelessly to shape seemed to unravel before his eyes. The outbreak of the First World War devastated him more than any business loss ever could, for it struck at the core of his deepest conviction that humanity could outgrow violence and resolve its conflicts through reason. The Peace Palace of The Hague, which he had envisioned as a temple of arbitration, opened only a year before, now stood almost mocked by the carnage that engulfed Europe. Carnegie, who had given vast sums to prevent war, was left helpless as nations turned his steel into weapons of destruction. He retreated increasingly into private life, his spirits broken, his optimism clouded by grief. In the years that followed, his health declined, and those around him describe a man who had once dominated industries and ideas reduced to sorrow at the betrayal of his hopes. Yet even in this twilight, Carnegie continued to give. He established pensions for teachers, endowed scientific research, and supported causes across America and Britain, determined to distribute what remained of his fortune before death. By this time, he had given away over $350 million, nearly 90% of his wealth, to libraries, universities, foundations, and peace initiatives, making him the most prolific philanthropist of his era. Still, he could not give away his disappointment. Friends noted his melancholy, a sadness that lingered even as he lived in comfort at his estates in New York and Scotland. In 1914, he built Shadowbrook, a grand mansion in Massachusetts, but he spent little time there, preferring the familiarity of his Scottish retreat at Skibo Castle, where he surrounded himself with books, music, and the company of family. He doted on his only daughter, Margaret, ensuring her education and independence, and found solace in his wife, Louise, who stood by him through both triumph and sorrow. Yet the war haunted him. Reports of mass slaughter at the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres crushed his spirit, and though he tried to write optimistic reflections, they often ended in despair. In letters, he confessed that the war had destroyed his dream of a world guided by peace. The very steel that had made his fortune was now tearing Europe apart, and the contradiction was too painful to ignore. His correspondence with world leaders dwindled, his once constant stream of essays slowed, and he withdrew into silence. Visitors to Skibbo found a man who had once spoken endlessly about progress now staring quietly at the fire, lost in thought. Yet Carnegie remained a figure of immense stature. Presidents, prime ministers, and scholars still sought his advice, though he gave it sparingly. He remained committed to his philanthropy, signing over more millions to institutions even as his health waned. In 1919, with the war finally ended but peace fragile, Carnegie's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from pneumonia and other ailments of age, and in August of that year, at his home in Lenox, Massachusetts, he died at the age of 83. The official cause was bronchial pneumonia, but many who knew him believed he died of a broken heart, his spirit crushed by the war he had fought so hard to prevent. His death marked the end of an era. Obituaries hailed him as the greatest philanthropist of modern times, the immigrant boy who had risen from poverty to become the richest man in the world and then given his fortune away. Yet even in death, the contradictions of his life remained. For some, he was a hero of opportunity, a man who embodied the promise of America. For others, he was a robber baron whose fortune was built on the exploitation of workers and whose philanthropy could never erase the suffering of Homestead. His funeral was modest, reflecting his Scottish Presbyterian roots, and he was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Tarrytown, New York, not far from other titans of industry. The simple headstone contrasted sharply with the monumental institutions that bore his name, from Carnegie Hall to Carnegie Library scattered across continents. In the years that followed, his legacy was debated fiercely. Historians pointed to his transformative impact on education and culture, while labor activists remember the brutality of his mills. His dream of peace found partial fulfillment in the League of Nations, though it too faltered, and only later institutions like the United Nations would carry forward the vision he cherished. Today, Carnegie's twilight years remind us of the limits of wealth and the fragility of dreams. He had conquered industry, reshaped philanthropy, and sought to end war itself, but he left the world still scarred by conflict, still struggling with inequality, and still questioning the morality of fortunes amassed in sweat and blood. Yet he also left behind libraries that continue to serve, universities that continue to teach, and foundations that continue to pursue peace and knowledge. His twilight was marked by disappointment, but his legacy endures in the structures he built and the questions he forced humanity to ask. What should wealth serve? How should power be used? Can progress be measured only in steel and fortune, or must it also be judged in the lives of those left behind? In the fading years of his life, Andrew Carnegie embodied both triumph and tragedy, a titan of industry who became a benefactor of humanity, and a dreamer whose greatest dream crumbled before his eyes. The story of Andrew Carnegie cannot be told in isolation, for his rise, fortune, and contradictions were inseparable from the wider era that historians later called the Gilded Age, a period stretching from the 1870s to the early 1900s when America experienced unprecedented industrial growth, staggering accumulations of wealth, and equally staggering depths of inequality. It was an age gilded on the surface, glittering with progress, railroads, skyscrapers, telegraphs, electric lights, and fortunes measured in millions. But beneath the shine lay shadows of poverty, exploitation, corruption, and conflict. Carnegie's empire of steel was both a triumph of ingenuity and a reflection of the age's harsh realities, and the ghosts of the Gilded Age continued to haunt American history. The expansion of industry transformed the United States from a largely agrarian republic into the world's leading industrial power within a single generation. Cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York swelled with immigrants who provided the labor for factories and mills, while railroads stitched together a continental economy. Carnegie, Rockefeller in oil, Vanderbilt in railroads, and Morgan in finance became household names. titans of industry who wielded influence at rival presidents. They built fortunes so vast that they seemed to belong to another world, insulated by mansions, private clubs, and European travels. At the same time, millions of workers lived in crowded tenements, toiled in dangerous conditions, and struggled to secure even basic dignity. Strikes, riots, and clashes between labor and capital erupted across the country, from the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 to the Haymarket Fair in 1886 and Homestead in 1892. These conflicts revealed the deep fault lines of an America in transition, where promises of opportunity collided with realities of exploitation. Politics in the Gilded Age mirrored its contradictions. Corruption was rampant, with political machines like New York's Tammany Hall trading favors for votes, and senators often accused of serving corporations more than citizens. Yet it was also a time of reform movements. As farmers rallied in the populist movement, urban activists pushed for sanitation and housing improvements, and journalists exposed the abuses of power in scathing exposés. Carnegie himself was both subject and symbol of these critiques. To admirers, he embodied the immigrant dream, proving that through determination and vision one could rise from poverty to immense success. To critics, he represented the robber baron, a man who crushed unions, amassed wealth through exploitation, and then sought redemption through philanthropy. Both views were true, and it was this paradox that made him a quintessential figure of the age. The ghosts of the Gilded Age are visible in the statistics of inequality. By 1900, the richest 1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom half combined. Carnegie's fortune, vast as it was, represented only one part of this concentration, but it symbolized the system that enabled it. While he built libraries and universities, his workers labored for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, with little chance of upward mobility. The gulf between rich and poor grew so stark that it prompted debates about the very future of democracy. Could a republic survive when power was so concentrated in the hands of a few? Could opportunity remain real when fortunes were inherited rather than owned? These questions echoed in newspapers, legislatures, and homes. At the same time, the Gilded Age produced innovations that permanently altered society. Electricity, telephones, automobiles, and skyscrapers reshaped daily life, while science and medicine advanced rapidly. Carnegie's steel built the framework of modern cities, just as Rockefeller's oil-fueled lamps and engines, and Edison's inventions brought light to the night. The age was contradictory because it was both brutal and transformative, both exploitative and creative. For Carnegie, the ghost of the Gilded Age followed him into his later years. No matter how many libraries he built, he could not erase the memory of Homestead or the perception that his fortune had been born of exploitation. Critics continued to question whether philanthropy could justify inequality, whether it was right that a single man should decide where millions of dollars would be spent while workers had no voice in their own wages. Reformers argued that systemic change, not private charity, was the answer, advocating for antitrust laws, labor protections, and progressive taxation. Indeed, the very concentration of wealth exemplified by Carnegie helped spark the progressive-era reforms of the early 20th century, from the Sherman Antitrust Act to labor legislation. The ghosts of the Gilded Age also linger in the legacy of cities themselves. Carnegie's libraries remain, often still serving their communities, but they stand alongside crumbling mill towns where steel production declined in the 20th century, leaving unemployment and poverty. The grandeur of the era's achievements is tempered by the ruins it left behind. To walk through Pittsburgh today is to see both sides of Carnegie's age. Grand cultural institutions bearing his name and the memory of neighborhoods that once housed exhausted steelworkers. For America, the Gilded Age was a mirror held up to its ideals. It demonstrated the heights of innovation and ambition possible in a free society, but it also revealed the dangers of unrestrained capitalism. The ghosts remind us that progress cannot be measured only in monuments and fortunes, but must also be judged by the lives of ordinary people. Carnegie's life embodied both the glory and the ghosts of the era, the promise of opportunity fulfilled, and the price paid in sweat and blood. In the end, the Gilded Age left behind a dual legacy: the steel and libraries that endure as symbols of achievement, and the inequalities and conflicts that remain warnings. It was an age of brilliance and brutality, gilded but not golden, whose shadows stretch into the present. The legacy of Andrew Carnegie cannot be measured solely in the libraries he built, the universities he endowed, or the fortune he distributed. Nor can it be judged entirely by the strikes he broke, the wages he cut, or the lives lost in his mills. It exists instead in the shadow of steel, a paradoxical inheritance of progress and exploitation, generosity and ruthlessness, vision and contradiction. Carnegie's life traced the trajectory of the Gilded Age itself: the rise of an immigrant boy from poverty to unimaginable wealth, the transformation of America into the world's leading industrial power, and the enduring debates over the morality of fortune. His story offers lessons not just about one man, but about the system that shaped him and that he, in turn, helped to shape. The first lesson lies in the power of opportunity. Carnegie's journey from a one-room weaver's cottage in Dunfermline to the heights of American industry demonstrated the possibilities of mobility in a rapidly changing society. Access to a library, mentorship from Thomas A. Scott, and the chance to master new technologies like the telegraph and the railroad propelled him upward. His rise reflected the dynamism of a nation in transition, when new industries created openings for those with ambition and skill. Yet the second lesson lies in the limits of that opportunity. For every Carnegie, there were thousands who toiled in mills without escape, whose children worked in factories instead of classrooms, whose lives ended in accidents or poverty. Carnegie's fortune was not the product of opportunity alone, but of structures that concentrated power and suppressed labor. His story reminds us that while individual success is possible, systemic inequality can deny opportunity to the many even as it enriches the few. The third lesson is the transformative potential of wealth when directed toward public purposes. Carnegie's libraries, his universities, his support for science and culture have endured for more than a century, shaping lives far beyond his own time. His insistence that the wealthy should act as stewards of their fortunes established a model of philanthropy that continues today, influencing figures from John D. Rockefeller to Bill Gates. He demonstrated that private wealth, however acquired, could be mobilized to expand knowledge and opportunity in ways governments of his era did not. But the fourth lesson is the danger of philanthropy as a substitute for justice. Carnegie gave away hundreds of millions, yet he resisted raising wages or improving conditions in his mills when he had the chance. His philanthropy provided books but not bread, knowledge but not safety, opportunity for future generations but not relief for those whose labor had built his fortune. This contradiction underscores the enduring question: can philanthropy redeem inequality, or must justice require structural change? Carnegie's life also teaches us about the double edge of progress. Steel transformed the world, building bridges, skyscrapers, and railroads, but it also armed nations for war, fueled imperial ambitions, and destroyed landscapes. The very material that symbolized modernity also symbolized destruction. Carnegie recognized this duality, devoting his later years to peace. But he could not prevent the First World War, where steel weapons turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. His fortune, made in steel, thus cast a shadow over the world it built, a reminder that technological progress is never purely benevolent but carries consequences shaped by how it is used. Finally, the lesson of Carnegie's fortune lies in the persistence of inequality. The Gilded Age debates over wealth concentration, labor rights, and the responsibilities of the rich echo in today's world, where billionaires again command fortunes larger than many nations, and where philanthropy coexists uneasily with inequality. Carnegie's assertion that the man who dies rich dies disgraced remained provocative, challenging both the wealthy and society to consider how resources should be used. But the contradictions of his life remind us that generosity without justice cannot erase exploitation, and that fortunes built on inequality carry shadows that no philanthropy can fully dispel. In the end, Carnegie's story is not one of saints or villains, but of complexity. He was a man who rose by seizing opportunity, who built by embracing innovation, who gave with vision, and who failed in moments of moral consequence. He embodied the strengths and weaknesses of industrial capitalism, leaving behind a legacy that is both inspiring and troubling. The shadow of steel that follows him is not only his own but ours as well, a reflection of the choices societies make about wealth, power, and responsibility. His libraries still stand. His name still graces institutions. His philosophy still influences debate. But so too do the questions he left unanswered. What is the true measure of a life of wealth? Can fortunes cleanse their origins? And can progress ever be just if it leaves behind those who labor at its foundation? These questions, born in the age of Carnegie, remain alive in ours, ensuring that his story is not simply history but a mirror in which each generation sees its own struggles reflected.